Hello, Eric. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. How are you today?
Doing well. Nice sunny day in the Bay Area today.
It is a beautiful day, so I so very much appreciate you staying indoors for an hour to speak with me today. And I'm so excited to speak about all the things with you today, particularly around becoming better men and helping others become better men. What brought you to this work? What made you want to focus on men and becoming better men?
Yeah, there's a personal and a kind of a professional arc to this. The personal arc is that, especially when it comes to managing high desire sexually or some relationship challenges, I've had some of these difficulties myself. I've dealt with sexual shame. I grew up Catholic. I've had a hard time because I really want to be and have always wanted to be an ethical, good, loving person. But I've had some errors and mistakes in that process, including some affairs in my still ongoing 24-year relationship. We'll celebrate our anniversary on Sunday. And as I worked to integrate my sexuality, my desire, and learn how to be in relationships better, that kind of naturally made me more skillful at helping men in my private practice, and in particular, men in couples, helping them understand what was going on for them and what their partners were asking of them. And
Hmm. Hmm.
so I've really been specializing in sex and relationship issues in my practice for a long time. And in particular, with the Me Too movement coming forward, I don't work with the kinds of predators that we saw in the headlines, but I do work with men who, despite their values and their conscience, have some difficulties with creating experiences of unintentional consent violations, unintentional experiences of pressure. And because of my experience working with other men and my personal process around navigating that, I felt like I had something to say about it. So I tried to put it into a
Mm,
book for men to help them so they don't have to figure it out from scratch every time.
mm. I very much appreciate that. I appreciate your vulnerability and sharing your own challenges. And it's true, a lot of us, like good, very well intentioned men, we see bad things happen in the world by men. And we're like, how can I make sure I don't become this person? How do I make sure I can lead, a really good example? And it's interesting that you did mention sort of unintentional consent violations because this is something that I've been seeing, more and more often along the lines of, say, certain community or certain group of people where there is that sort of, I'll call it, I'll repeat what you said, unintentional consent violations. And it kind of ties into one of the big reasons like a lot of sexual assaults like aren't reported is it's like you have two options. One, do nothing. Two, go to the police. And there's not a whole lot like in between that. And
Mhm.
I have seen some men go through like certain restorative justice, accountability things and different things
Sure.
like that. But it's always, a bit messy. So like how does say like a community, maybe a sex positive community work with and help, say, a man who is trying to be good, but people are telling him, yeah, what you did, that other night at that event that we had, that really made, so and so really uncomfortable. And now they don't even want to be in the same room as you.
Yeah. You know, I'm going to observe first that the question of how can the community help him, I think that wouldn't be where I would start. I think that the community's first job is to protect its most vulnerable members.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the individual man's responsibility to attend to the humility of recognizing the impact of his behavior and to beginning to chart his path to figuring out what to do to understand that behavior, the impact of the behavior, how did this happen, and what am I going to do to make sure that that doesn't happen again? And then if the community has an opportunity for him, I really like restorative justice models, especially when they're oriented first to protecting the person who was harmed. When it's not just a restorative justice model so that we can, as a community, can continue to go on as we were, but how can we heal our most vulnerable member?
Mhm.
What can the individual in our community who caused the harm learn to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And what can we do as a community to take responsibility for the fact that this took place within our community? How are we going to respond together to raise consciousness and to increase the potential for prevention?
I love that. I love the emphasis on protecting the most vulnerable members because, yeah, there is that desire to help say the offender, um, and focusing everything around the hurting and the healing that needs to happen.
Yeah.
So, kind of segueing into this next question, because I feel like we're already talking about it. And one of the reasons your work really piqued my interest is that we're both in the Bay Area. And I won't get into the specifics, but there's a local community that's in a bit of a crisis right now because the head, basically, of the organization was arrested for domestic violence. And again, I won't go into the details, but it brought up a lot, and the whole situation brings up a lot for people because I think the story seems all too familiar. We
Hmm.
have a charismatic, smart, leader who seems very nice and genuine and even talks and perhaps leads circles around consent and healing and growth and emotional intelligence and love and light and all the really, warm things. And
Hmm.
suddenly this person ends up doing something really terrible. And whether it's a local community or whether it's, Bill Cosby or Bikram Chaudhary or I don't know, Scientology or something like that,
Right.
what is it with charismatic, warm leaders who are men
Yeah.
abusing their power in really terrible ways?
Yeah. I prepared for this conversation by identifying two lenses, and I think I might add one or two more. So I think first, I'm going to talk about people who really have a repeated pattern of predatory behavior, just because you alluded to some people in the news who have that pattern. And I really, in many ways, I think of those people as a special case. At the beginning of my book, I say, who is this book for and who's this not book for? Who is this book not for? And if there are people who enjoy violating consent, then all of the communication tools in the world, all of the consent frameworks in the world, all of the practices of what our community agreements are will not be effective in stopping
Hmm.
the predator's behavior, because the predator's behavior will be to present the charismatic front and to engage in predatory behavior in private. And that
Mm-hmm.
is
Hmm.
a sad and vulnerable truth about our human experience, that there are people who like that. And it's a special case of what's going on in those people's psychology. And it is not the same, even as a narcissist or somebody who commits domestic abuse, but is horrified by the explosions of their behavior and who doesn't want to do that.
Hmm.
Those folks are operating in a very different way than most of us are on a day-to-day basis. So I don't really speak to that situation. Now, when it comes to
Mm.
people who have explosive anger, desire problems, difficulty listening to consent, but are genuinely horrified by their behavior. Their guts turn when they recognize the impact of their behavior. Typically, what I'm looking at there is poor training, poor self regulation tools that they have been trained in the process. And they do maybe at one level have study, but they haven't integrated that study into how to manage their own attachment needs. And
Mm.
that vulnerability will be a part of any community. We see that in leaders of all sorts, where maybe they know how to identify what the right principles are, but living these principles of kindness, consent, self regulation, mindfulness, they can be hard. And so to recognize that a person has an error in that is not to say that what they were teaching is not accurate. And it's
Mm,
one of the reasons that I chose when I was putting my book out to identify my own mistakes in this process, because I wanted to point to the principles, not to myself. And that's where I'm going to bring in kind of a third lens. One of the things I think that we can do to prevent our communities from being vulnerable to these kinds of community based betrayals where our charismatic leaders turn out to be flawed human beings is that we need flatter leadership structures with
mm,
councils and communities where our leaders can be vulnerable with us about their faults and flaws, and where we can know those and they don't have to hide those faults and flaws in order to bring their gifts forward. The more that we
mm,
can have structures that eliminate hierarchical power, and the more that we have leaders who are allowed to be full, multidimensional human beings, the less vulnerable we will be to these kinds of betrayals, in
mm,
my opinion.
mhm, mhm. I love that. It's a very nuanced while simultaneously precise answer. So I love that you did kind of mention the dichotomy that particularly happens with narcissists of how you said charismatic in public, predatory in private,
Mhm.
and how it's sort of part of the strategy.
Mhm.
And also this basic idea I love of flat leadership structures, that part of the problem is when the power is centralized within one person. We know that absolute power corrupts. And what do I want my next question to be? I had a lead in. Oh, right. And I also love that we're identifying the multi-dimensionality of a human being, because sometimes people like to point out, like, oh, did you know that this person that you worship is actually a bad person? Like, I don't really fact check it too much, but people are like, did you know Dr. Martin Luther King like beat his wife, or Gandhi did this, or Mother Teresa did this? And I'm like, yeah, that, like, all those people are human.
I have a perspective on this that I'd like to share, which is I totally agree with you that it's so important that we begin to see our leaders as human. And I really value this orientation to holding people in power accountable. I know you didn't say that you don't, but I think it's great that we're elevating that it's kind of more important to us at a certain level that you're a good human being than it is that you create good art, for
Mm,
example. Um, it's more important to us that you are a good parent to your kids than that you're a successful person in career. That's, I think, a beautiful value shift in our culture.
it would be a wonderful shift. I'm just thinking of, I don't know, just like celebrities that that have 8, 10 kids and continue their work and aren't, good with their families, good with the real loving relationships day to day.
That will always be true. Yeah.
So I love this talk about men, and I am curious, the person who might respond to this conversation with not all men, or
Yeah.
even men who think that men are just under attack right now. Men are the most, what do they even say, oppressed people right now. Everyone just wants to hate on men. What's your advice for that response?
Yeah. Number one, accountability is not oppression.
Hmm.
And a large part of what's happening is exactly that accountability.
Mm,
And the feedback loops are closing in the sense that the time from a moment of hurt to the feedback about that hurt is getting decreased significantly.
Mm, mhm,
And I see this in my office a lot, that, not all men, or I'm not that kind of guy, or I would never XYZ. Meanwhile, his partner was in the session with me, in front of him, just describing their experience of feeling pressured in the relationship. And it's exactly this distinction between intention and impact. And I think that a lot of men are beginning to get the feedback, yeah, you may not intend this negative experience. You may not intend to be unskillful. You may have love in your heart and kindness in your heart, but how you are delivering that is not loving to me. In Bell Hook's book, All About Love, she really makes this distinction that the only love that really matters is being skillful in helping the other person feel loved. And otherwise, it's just a feeling inside of you.
mm,
And in that sense, it's really important to get curious about how the other people in your life experience you. Because if you aren't attuning to that feedback, then it doesn't matter how you feel about your own self or what kind of person you want to be. It's important to recognize whether you are pointed in that direction and accepting feedback that will help you get there.
mhm. I love that so much. I love so much of what you just said. First off, I see it like the slogan on a protest sign: accountability is not oppression.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it is, it's understandable, but it is always surprising a decade or two after the fact when some sort of, say, assault or violence happens that a person is now, say, going on trial for it. And as you mentioned, the amount of time between the hurt and the feedback to the hurt is increasing, where someone doesn't receive that
Mm.
feedback. And this is also an idea I have been exploring in my own life. How you said that the only love that really matters is being skillful in helping the other person feel love. Because I have been really thinking about how understanding is crucial to love. And a lot of people have an intention to love, by even saying I love you, but if not taking the time to attune to understand this person, to understand their unique needs and how you can meet those needs, then the love doesn't advance any further.
Mhm.
So let's talk about, before we get into your book, The Better Man, and how we can help men. I want to tie this back to an idea you mentioned earlier around how hard it is to kind of do the work with the men that need to do the work. So, like, if I write a book in consent, the guy, not doing consent is probably not going to read it. Well, the person who's always worried about, oh, am I doing things right, is probably doing an okay job. So, how do we bring the work of becoming better men into the men that need it most?
Yeah. So, first, I think unfortunately, a lot of men are brought to this work by experiencing the consequences of their unskillful behavior, unskillful loving in relationship. And it's something of a truism. I've been talking with a lot of people who do men's work, whether that's relationship coaching or therapists or authors or retreat leaders. A lot of men are brought to this work because the modus operandi to stay safe for men becomes, keep your head down, keep doing the same thing, don't open up, don't get vulnerable, because the training and socialization that we experience as boys is that when we are vulnerable, weak, inadequate, wrong, imprecise, inaccurate, is that we will be put at the bottom of some kind of social hierarchy. We will experience social teasing, hazing,
Mhm.
insults, ostracizing, being put out of social community, up to and including experiencing direct physical violence against ourselves or witnessing other boys being the recipient of physical violence because they we're vulnerable. And we are equally impacted by that, even if we just witness it.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, when it comes to the idea of opening your heart, getting vulnerable, and accepting that maybe you aren't doing things skillfully and well, it often means for a lot of men opening up and going through in our nervous system this literally wired fear that we are going to be attacked right now. And it's why men, even receiving skillful feedback in their relationships, often end up feeling criticized, insulted, and put down. And so I've been talking with a lot of these other people doing men's work, like, is there any other way to invite men in? And I've come up with, in conversation, a couple of key pieces. One, the armor that we put on costs us a lot of energy. It leaves us feeling extremely tired and easily overwhelmed in relationship. So, couldn't you feel less tired? Couldn't you feel more fulfilled? Couldn't you feel more loved? Couldn't you be more satisfied with your relationship with your children and your community? It ends up being what I've found so far is the best call in to doing this work and to listening to the feedback.
Mm. Mhm. Mhm. I always love that metaphor of armor. I use it in yoga too because, when you can't touch your toes, you feel restricted. And it's like, it's true. When you put armor on, you think it's going to protect you. But what does it end up doing? Restricting you, creating heaviness. Armor is very heavy.
Putting a barrier between you and others that prevents intimacy.
Right. Preventing authentic connection. Absolutely. And I do love that you did bring up this idea of regulation because I feel like this is my own theory right now. I feel like 20 years ago, therapists were like communication, communication, communication. Now all I hear about is regulation, regulation, regulation. Just how important it is to be able to regulate ourselves. And earlier you mentioned, for example, anger issues, and unrestricted anger is the source of a lot of violence and problems in the world. So what are what are your thoughts on regulation and how we might bring it into our lives?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that regulation is definitely a key to improving relationships. I always also like to just gently balance out the individualism of it because we do also consistently function in relationship and community off of co regulation. Where when my emotions have gotten the best of me, another person stepping forward and responding to me with kindness and care can help me regulate myself. We can assist one another, just like parents assist their children in regulating all the time. One of the challenges that men experience is that if our dysregulation creates new barriers and fears in the people around us, especially if we're big, angry, loud, walled off, larger, physically stronger, or just our partner has experienced victimization at the hands of men, which is highly probable in any case in a partner of any gender, they may be afraid deeply of our dysregulation. So,
Mm,
since we can't force them into co regulation, our best start is to focus on our self regulation because that's what's in our control.
mhm, mhm,
And so, having balanced that out, I guess I just want to identify that what we mean with self regulation is actually many, many different steps. And so the first step of self regulation, of learning self regulation, is realizing after the fact that I was then not regulated.
mhm,
Then that awareness recedes into the present. So my awareness that I was dysregulated gets closer and closer to the moment of my dysregulation. Then
mhm,
I begin to be aware that I am dysregulated in the present. Then I learn to be able to interrupt that process. Then I am able to begin trying things to regulate myself. Then I get skillful at regulating myself. And then I'm able to self regulate sometimes and not others.
Mm-hmm. 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 So becoming aware
Yeah.
when and after we are dysregulated, and then working on interrupting that process.
Yep. Yep. And then self soothing. And I always like to talk about body, emotions, social, cognitive, and sensory or mindfulness tools as the pathways to that regulation.
Body, emotions, what is it?
Body, emotions, social, cognitive,
Social, cognitive,
sensory, and mindfulness.
and mindfulness.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Because you mentioned men's work, I am curious if you find certain approaches to men's work or certain male approaches that I don't know if you would disapprove of, but like make you a little uneasy or a little skeptical.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Like
Yeah.
so tell me about that. Yeah.
So I think we're seeing, unfortunately, a large media feedback loop right now around the manosphere. The media is highlighting, to a degree, on the heels of the Me Too movement, and appropriately, I want to identify problematic men's workers, people who are, part of the manosphere, who are really focused on circling the wagons of patriarchy and trying to blame others, whoever they are.
Mm,
And what I find characteristic of more skillful men's work is a couple of things. First of all, there's an orientation to moving forward with justice movements, whether that's feminism or social and racial justice, economic equality, and a recognition that all of those isms have also hurt men by weaponizing our role in culture and turning us into the soldiers that enforce those belief and power structures. And the second is that the men's work that I really tend to value is oriented to healing men's pain,
mm,
without pointing the finger at any other group for where that came from. And there's an attunement to the fact that men's violence comes from men's pain.
mm,
So, for example, one organization that I really respect is the Mankind Project. They do retreats and ongoing work to help men come together and open up emotionally and vulnerably with each other.
mm, mm. I love that. Even just the name, I'm like, yes, let's bring more kindness. Let's put the kind back in mankind.
Right.
I love that orientation to moving forward with justice movements and orientation to healing men's pain. And I love how you said men's violence comes from men's pain. And we
Yeah.
have to address those wounds.
Yeah. I also think that for me, my orientation to men's work also is very focused on the idea that I think all men, whether we're cisgender or trans men, and whether we are heterosexual, bi, gay, pan, we are safer and better as a community of men when we accept the diversity of men's experiences and integrate that into our community. So, heterosexual men are safer in men's work when gay men are explicitly welcomed and valued in a men's work community. White men are safer and are more likely to do better and more effective work in a men's community when black and brown men belong there too, and are when their voices are a part of the leadership. There is a way that our manhood is intersectional, and we need the diversity among men in order to reintegrate our multidimensional humanity.
I love it. We are safer and better as a community of men when we accept the diversity of men's experience.
Mhm.
So let's talk about The Better Man, a guide to consent, stronger relationships, and hotter sex.
Yeah.
That'll get people to buy
I hope
it.
so.
All
Yeah.
right. So let's talk. What are the first steps? What's the? I listen to this podcast. What do I want to do right after to become a better man?
So I think it's to recognize, just as we've already been talking about, patriarchy hurt us. Our difficulties in relationship come from the neglect that we have experienced in relationship skill building, in health information, everything from accurate anatomy and plumbing all the way through
Mm,
not being taught accurate understandings of what a sexual relationship is, how to have one, and what it looks like for real. That those wounds leave us in the position of not knowing how to deliver our love skillfully. Men are good, men's sex and men's desire is good, but because of that inadequate skill building and training, because of that neglect we experience in patriarchy, we are left at significant risk of being unwitting, unwanting to, uh, in the position of unwanting to perpetrate patriarchal wounds on our partners. And since those wounds exist in us, we have to start there and recognize they are there and then take responsibility for healing them on an individual and hopefully community basis.
hmm. I just had a big light bulb just pop up in my head because a lot of my work is on helping people love and
Mhm.
hence the Learn to Love podcast. And I often lament that there's no like love school and we don't learn the key skills of loving and being in relationship. And the light bulb is like, yes, because we sort of have taken an entire aspect of the human experience, such as being caring and kind and motherly, aka taking care of one's children,
Yeah.
and sort of down leveled it to like a feminine aspect that's become deprioritized in favor of power and strong armoring that we talked about.
Right. And then when we as boys don't see models of men who are taking care of their children, we mistakenly believe that that isn't a role that we can have, could be good at, could be skilled at, valuable in doing. And there's a, you know, feedback loop that we can get into. I see a fairly common dynamic that I see in my heterosexual couples is, he doesn't help with, she complains about him not helping with the kids or the household. And then he comes back and says, when I try to help, all I get is critique. And she says, well, that's because you're not doing it skillfully. And with some regularity, she's right. Sometimes I
Mhm.
do need to invite her to allow him the space to do it in a different way than she would. But very often, it's the critique in the process that prevents him from developing the skills too.
Mm,
And so, you know, the process of his inadequate skills in preparation to be in a relationship become a negative feedback loop that can prevents him from developing the skills even when he is in a relationship.
mm, mhm, mhm. So you write about 6 different dimensions of health that make for a healthy sex life. And if you don't want to get into all of them, you can just mention your favorite one. But what are those 6 dimensions?
Yeah, I'll mention the six: work life balance, friends and community, mental balance, body wellness, meaning and purpose, and sexual health. And what I'm really talking about there, I try to take as intersectional and systemic a view on each of those as I can, recognizing, for example, men on the lower end of income, it's much harder for them to find work life balance. But what I'm talking about is that when we have, for example, friends and community, then our sexual desire isn't just doing the work of trying to fulfill the sexual dimension of our life. If we don't have friends and community, it's also trying to help us build community. If we don't have mental balance, for example, we're experiencing periodic depression or lows or low self esteem, then our sexual life ends up carrying that load too. And when our sexual life is carrying too many different elements of our human well-being, we end up feeling this desperation to get into that sexually fulfilling experience because it's the only pathway we know to feel connected, intimate, vulnerable, balanced. And that's too much work for one dimension of our life to fulfill.
Mm. Hmm. It's true. I have heard more and more the only person a man has to confide in emotionally is with their life partner, while on average, women tend to have more close friends with which they can share and feel
Yeah.
connected to.
And that will be kind of weaponized by men in the manosphere as like, see, there's an epidemic of men's loneliness. And I'm like, yeah, but why are you lamenting and trying to find somebody out there to blame? If two men are lonely, wanting more friends, and those two men get together and become friends, they have now solved that problem with
Pair
each
up
other.
right there.
That's why I emphasize the necessity for men to get into friendships and community. And I give scripts for how to do that so that it's not just a directive, there's a step by step process to help them on their way.
So I asked you about the dimensions for a healthy sex life, and
Yeah.
you gave me work life balance,
Yeah.
friends and
Yeah.
community, mental wellness, meaning and purpose. So,
Yeah.
first off, it's not very sexy. But secondly,
Yeah.
aren't don't men just want sex all the time and are up for sex all the time? And aren't women the gatekeepers in society for sex? And isn't sex work the world's oldest profession because men just want it all the time?
No. So look, I've worked with enough couples that I have really been privileged to see that with some consistent regularity, men are the low desire partners in their sexual relationships, even heterosexual relationships. And it's always relative. I also work with gay couples, and somebody in there is the low desire partner relative to his husband. And so it isn't simple enough to just say men are wanted all the time. And part of what I am speaking to is the men's experience when you are the high desire partner. But also, I'm trying to validate the men who do want other dimensions to their lives, which is almost all of us, who are looking to for pathways to fulfill our whole being. And right when we start talking about how to get into a relationship, when we start talking about how to get into a consent conversation, there is an emergent element, your ability to be in a potential relationship while not pressuring, while not demanding, while not getting into a fantasy of, oh my gosh, this is going to be the person who fulfills all of my needs in life, comes from you taking care of your multidimensional wellness. When you do that, then your capacity to just bring sex to sex and not everything else starts to emerge. So you can be a lot more chill in a consent conversation and be like, oh, I don't know if that's what I really want here, because I have somebody to confide in. I have somebody to lean on because I have a sense of meaning and purpose at work or through my volunteer projects. What I'm looking for here is to be filled up, or for this reciprocity, or for this particular fantasy that I'd like to explore. And because I'm full in all of these other buckets of my life, I can say no to something that doesn't really fit me. And when I can say no, then I also make it much easier for my partner to say no. And now we can look for the hell yeah together. Yeah, and I'll tell you, it's with some regularity that the woman in a heterosexual relationship comes in as the high desire partner.
I love it. I love your embrace of the complexity and diversity of the human experience. And I wouldn't mind going a little bit into one of the dimensions, sexual health, particularly just because for a lot of people that means going to the doctor and getting an STD test and saying that you're clean. Or-
Mhm.
and what are aspects of sexual health that we should be thinking about?
So I'm going to cover kind of two of them. One of those is self pleasure, the capacity to create a rewarding, full body experience of self love can go a long way to eliminating a sense of dependence on a partner for pleasure and can go a long way to creating for people the experience of autonomy and independence, again, to be able to consent or agree to relationships and sex that promises to be exciting and pleasurable, and to say no to sex that isn't. If I know I can create really satisfying, knee shaking pleasure for myself, then there's got to be an additive component to the process if a partner is offering to share their body with me. It's not just pleasure. Now it's us coming together for a specific purpose. So that's the first one. The other one that I want to address is just understanding the difference between fantasy and reality. That's whether it's fantasy in the mind or whether it's, for example, fantasy and erotica or pornography. It's so important, especially if you didn't get a multidimensional human orientation to what sexual relationships look like, to not imagine that the fantasy of pornography is the reality of partnered sex. And I use this example, I've not ever heard of a guy who went to the top of a building, tied a fire hose around his chest, jumped off, and tried to break into a window on a lower floor. We can watch Die Hard and know that that's not a thing you go out and do. But when our sex education is inadequate to preparing us for multidimensional human sexual relationship with a partner, we can sometimes get tricked into thinking that what we see in pornography is real human sex instead of stunt workers with stunt performers with cut scenes where all of the safety, all of the consent, all of the lubrication is being applied, all of the warm up is being done off camera or on the cutting room floor. And we can think that this is what we should do without thinking that we need to talk with our partner about it.
hmm hmm Well, that does make me wonder. Like, I keep asking, what's your response to a man saying this? Because
Yeah.
when you said, "Oh, we got to have a rewarding full body experience of self love that can reduce dependent on a partner for pleasure," what do you say to the man who's like, "I do that twice a day. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
That's me and my computer."
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to start with I'm not trying to shame anybody for their current masturbation practice. If you are masturbating for 2 minutes on your own twice a day and that's not causing any problems in your life, awesome. If you are masturbating to reduce your stress, awesome. If you're masturbating to help yourself get to sleep, awesome. But it is a different thing to spend time thinking about a full body, pleasurable experience where you are loving yourself and taking care of yourself, touching non erogenous zones, showering and preparing, laying out the toys or the lubricant, and allowing yourself to engage in an unfolding process that leaves you feeling deeply fulfilled, not just like a little bit of tension release that was taking place in your genitals is now complete. That might be achievable in 2 minutes, but a full body experience of self validation and love probably takes a little bit more time.
I love that. As we're winding down, I'm just before I get to my final question, I just want to say thank you for coming on. And is there any? We've covered so many different topics, and is there anything you feel has been missing so far in this conversation?
I feel like we've covered a lot, which I'm really grateful for. One of the things that I often cover here, I already had an opportunity to say, which is men are good, men's sexes and desire is good. So if it's coming out sideways, where did that happen? But another thing that I often like to
Hmm.
address is if there's a man in your life and you would like to help him, I always want to start with keep in mind you can't do his work for him. And your support needs to come from a place of generosity, not from a place of attempting to regulate him to create your own experience of protection. Protect yourself first. And if that's taken care of, and you're trying to be loving, generous, and kind, start with just being non judgmental and inquiring. What is that? What's going on? How are you feeling? And listen with silence. For a lot of men, because we have the experience of being traumatized, big T or little t, trauma around our vulnerability, it often takes us a lot of silence and stillness to
Hmm.
believe that an inquiry about our inner experience is real and safe. And it will often take multiple episodes of asking that question and sitting in the silence before he'll feel safe enough to begin even looking inward for the answers.
Hmm. I love that. Men are good. Men's sex and desire is good. If it comes out sideways, we ask, how does that happen? Because we can extrapolate that to people too. People are good. We're all fundamentally good. We have a loving heart inside of us. If things come out sideways, how does that happen? What happened to you? Where are you wounded that's causing this behavior?
Yeah,
And as a contemplative practitioner, I love your emphasis on the silence and stillness that we can use to begin looking inward for the answers.
yeah,
So, thank you so much, Eric. I have to finish by asking the question I ask all of my guests, which is, what do you wish everyone knew about love?
that love is about giving the love that is needed, not giving the love that you feel or are inclined to. That's what makes it skillful. And that means you have to ask, not guess or think you already know.
Don't make assumptions.
Yeah, yeah,
And it is true. There's always all sorts of stereotypes about how the genders relate in relationships, but there's always a hint of truth. Like you've probably seen that video where the woman has a nail in her head, and she's like, "I just have this headache. I think it's the nail." There
yeah.
is a huge tendency as men to go to premature problem solving, straight to fixing, straight to the solution, rather
Yes.
than give a person what they need, that attuned emotional resonance that you've been speaking of.
Yeah. I always like to, whenever I have a problem solving person, it is true, often men, I always tell him there is a place and a time for that, and it's coming. But
Patience, young
first it has
Padawan.
to come with connection,
Mm,
empathy, and the person feeling heard and understood. And then you get to have the consent conversation of, would you like solutions or did you just want me to hear what's going on for you?
absolutely. So thank you so much, Dr. Eric. Can you say your last name for me so
Sure,
I don't butcher it?
FitzMedrud.
Madrud, nice.
FitzMedrud.
FitzMedrud,
Mm-hmm.
for coming on to the show, author of The Better Man, A Guide to Consent, Stronger Relationships, and Hotter Sex. And for our listeners that want to learn more about you, how can they find you?
My website is drericfitz.com, DRERICFITZ.com, and you can also find me on most social media at Dr. Eric Fitz.
Wonderful. This has been a really incredible conversation. I really loved your measured, clear, and nuanced answer to the multidimensionality and complexity of the human experience. And it's such an important conversation I feel like to have now. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to have a rich conversation like this.